Hey everybody, Biohack here. In today's video, we're going to talk about one of the most important things in Raid Shadow Legends when it comes to efficient utilization of resources. In particular, we're going to be looking at when the best time to pull shards is and how many shards you need to pull on average to get a legendary champion once you factor in the mercy system that exists within the game. I recently ran the numbers on all of this, and I was super surprised, even as a player who's played this game for years, just how much of an impact the mercy system has on how many shards you need to pull on average to get a legendary champion. So I want to walk through how that math works, like what the actual number of shards you need to pull is on average given different points at where you're at in mercy, and how that interacts with a 10x event and a 2x event to help you decide based on actual math whether it's better for you to pull on that 10x event, pull on that 2x event, or even whether maybe a buy one get one event is actually the best option. Hint hint, it probably is. So yeah, hopefully you'll stick around with me, as this is going to be a little bit of a math heavy video, but I think it's really interesting, and we're going to go ahead and jump into it. All right, so the first thing we got to address is the actual math behind how many shards you need to pull to get a legendary champion. So for those of you who don't know, there is a system in the game called the Mercy system that has a dramatic impact on this number. The way the mercy system works is as you pull shards, once you hit a certain number without getting a legendary champion, every subsequent shard that you pull will have a boosted rate of getting a legendary, and it goes up every time you pull a shard without getting a legendary. So for ancient and void shards, once you hit 200 shards pulled without getting a legendary champion, every shard you pull after that will add a 5% increase to getting a legendary. This means it's basically, or not basically, it is impossible to pull 220 shards without getting a legendary champion, because on your 220th shard you will have a 100% chance of pulling a legendary. This serves as essentially a bad RNG protection effect. But due to the way like the probability around these kind of events works, is that bad RNG actually represents a huge amount of how many fails would go into an average. I said that a little confusingly, but basically what it means is that it dramatically brings down the average number of shards you need to pull to get a legendary, because the luckiest you can possibly get is essentially a one tap, a one pull. You pull one shard, you get one legendary, but there is no cap on how unlucky you can get if it wasn't for this mercy system. And so what that means is if you look at the average, it's like more people will get less than the average, but some people will have really bad RNG, which helps give you your overall average in the statistics. But because we cut it off so that it's impossible for anyone to get really bad RNG, that dramatically pulls down the number that we need in terms of how many shards we have to pull to get a legendary champion. For those of you who aren't aware of my BDO content, the math behind this is actually very similar to the fail stacking math in BDO. In BDO, what happens is every time you go for an upgrade attempt, if it fails, you boost what we call your fail stack, and that increases your odds of getting a success on your next attempt. So it's the same kind of thing here with the mercy system, except for it's flat all the way up until you get 200. And then after that, that's when you get the boosted rates. So I'll dig into the details a little bit, but without getting too complex, the way you actually solve this in terms of the probability is by using what's called the Markov chain stationary distribution, which essentially adjusts your odds as you're going through these different events. I use this math all the time for my BDO content, so it's very familiar for me here. I've done it calculating it using the Markov chain stationary distribution. I've also wrote scripts to do the simulation, so I'm pretty confident in the numbers that I'm going to show you. But before I show you these numbers, I want you to go pause this video, scroll down into the comments section, and I want you to guess how many ancient shards you need to pull in order to get a legendary champion, assuming there's no 2x events. So ancient shards have an average of a 0.5% chance of giving you a legendary, and I want you to guess before I show you the math, how many do you need to pull to get a legendary champion starting from 0 mercy if there's no events going on. Okay, you done that? Pause the video, scroll down, put your guess. All right, now I'm going to show you the numbers. Bam, here's your numbers. Okay, so what do we have in this spreadsheet? First, we have our mercy count. This is telling us how many shards were into mercy. And here is the average number of shards you need to pull to get a legendary champion. So a minute ago, I asked you to look at ancients or voids. They're both the same. So non-sacreds, starting at 0 mercy, no events. Average number of shards you need to pull, 128.9. I don't know about you guys, but even though I'm pretty familiar with this kind of math, I was still really surprised at just how much of an impact the mercy system has here. I mean, it's cutting down the number of shards by a lot. I was asking other content creators and streamers and stuff for raid, people who, platinum arena level players, like how many shards you need to pull. This same kind of question. And I was getting numbers like 170, 180. Yeah, really surprised by just how much of an impact the mercy system has. One of the important other takeaways from this spreadsheet is if we look at how many sacreds do you need to pull, or non-sacreds do you need to pull on a 2x event versus a 10x event, or no event, we see that the number is not nearly what people think when they think a 2x event. Like, you think, okay, if I have twice the odds, I'm going to pull twice the legendary champions, but really that's not true. The fact is, if you took a large enough sample size and enough shards, you're only getting maybe about 35% more legendary champions on a 2x versus no event. And it's just because the way the probability works is it's very, very skewed towards people who get lucky, and then people who get super, super unlucky have really bad luck and then cancel out the good RNG, and that's how you get your average. But because the mercy system prevents people from getting really, really bad luck, it just means that we're like skewing everything towards better than average. Average would be like 200 in this case, since it's a 0.5% chance of getting a shard. And so once you factor that in, you see that, this 2x event is not nearly as important as people think it is. It's not you're getting twice as many legendary champions. No, you're getting 35%-ish more legendary champions starting at 0 mercy. And the other thing is as we scroll down this list and we see, okay, how does it change as we get further and further down our mercy count, we see that the gap starts getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And so if we look at, say, 100 shards in, this is halfway to mercy. Now we've gone from needing to pull, 180 to get a legendary champion 128 to 82, Like, this is huge. This has had a dramatic impact on the number of shards versus only 66 for a 2x event. Like, we're not really saving that many shards even halfway through mercy. And so when we start to factor in what a 10x does to the probability of getting a champion that we actually want, we really start to see that, 10x events are actually a lot better than people think they are. Or at least it's a matter of this... the non-events are not nearly as important as we think they are. Like, the 2x events are not as powerful as people expect. And, we know that, I mean, this is kind of common knowledge. It's like, the further you are in your mercy system, the better you are to pull for like a BOGO or a 10x. We see that kicks in really early. You don't have to be far in your mercy system. Now, there's a one caveat to this, which is that you have to have enough shards to pull until you hit the mercy system. So, if your odds of pulling a legendary champion on exactly shard 100, which has a 0.5% chance, is still 1 in 200 for that particular one. This is the average, assuming that you were going to keep pulling and pulling and pulling until you hit mercy. So this provides further strong incentive to make sure you're building up large stockpile of shards and you're pulling all your shards in like one big pile, as opposed to this idea of pulling shards for every single event. Like, you want to be pulling shards pretty rarely once you're a more endgame player and you have a well-established roster. And this is the math that kind of justifies that. But still, for whales and other people who have lots of shards, this these kind of numbers are really important. And then, this is only halfway to mercy. It gets worse as we get closer and closer to mercy. I mean, by the time we actually get to mercy, which is 200 shards, we can see that it's basically the same number of shards to pull a legendary champion, regardless of whether it's a 2x event or not. I mean, and even, down 170 here, it's like, 3 more shards is all you have to pull on average to get a legendary champion. Like, you can start to see that this 2x event really has way less of an impact than people think, especially as you get lower and lower down this mercy. So in a minute, we're going to go and look at how I would actually calculate the math on whether or not you should pull on a 10x or a 2x using some of the numbers in this spreadsheet. But I think this is really important stuff to understand here. Just how much of an impact the mercy system has on the number of shards you need to pull, and then what kind of shards do you need to pull on average to get a legendary champion, to give you an idea of what every shard represents in terms of number of legendaries. So, hopefully this is useful to you guys. These numbers really surprised me. Um, I talked a little bit about how the actual math works. Again, that I calculated this using the Markov chain stationary distribution, and I also checked all these numbers by simulating it as well with a little script that I wrote. So yeah, pretty confident in this, but still really, really surprising numbers. So I hope you found it useful. All right, so now that we've answered the question of how many shards do we need to pull to get a legendary, we want to look a little more specifically at how many shards do we need to pull to get a useful legendary. Because the reality is there's a lot more champions in the game than we may actually want on our account. Unless we're just going for general collection, most of the legendary champions in the game aren't really that useful to a player who's been playing the game for a long time. So that's when we start to think about pulling on a 10x versus a 2x. So how do we look at the math behind this? The equation I like to use is one that looks something like this. Essentially what it is it's the number of shards to get a legendary champion versus the probability of getting a useful legendary champion. The reality is we just calculated how many shards we need to get or need to pull on average. That's what the other spreadsheet is for. So now we need to look at what is the probability of actually getting a useful champion. There are something like 204 legendary champions in the game right now. I can't remember the exact numbers. Some of them are voids. There's and some of them can't be pulled from shards. So there's roughly 140 champions in the game that you can pull from shards that are legendary right now. And for any given player, the number that are actually useful is going to vary a lot. For endgame players, you really only care about fairly specific niche champions. Usually things for arena, like things like your Kaimar and your Duchess, and your Rhodos. But I mean, there's a lot of champions in the game that just really don't do anything. Like you get them and they're just Vault Guardians. So for me as a player who's fairly endgame, there's maybe 15 champions that I think are kind of useful in the game. Now, this way of looking at the math isn't perfect because the reality is that it treats everything as binary. It's either useful or not useful, and reality is a lot more shades of gray. But I still think this is a useful construct to try and get some idea of whether it's better to pull on a 10x or a 2x, or how to, judge those two different things. So what do we have here? Here we have some hypothetical examples. On the left side over here, we have a situation where we have no 10x, no 2x, nothing. Just what are the odds we get a useful champion? If we say there's 15 useful champions in the game and about 140 total, that's like 10.7%, about 11% chance of getting a useful champion. We said it was about 129 shards to pull a legendary starting at 0 mercy. So what's that work out to? Well, it's about 1,200 shards to get a champion that is actually useful if we just pull with no events, no 10x, no 2x, nothing, no mercy. Just start pulling shards. What are the odds we get a useful one? About 1 in 1,200. Now, if we go to a scenario where there's a 10x event on for one of our useful champions, well, what do? Essentially what happens is we add 9 to the count for both the number of useful champions and the total for every champion that is useful in that 10x. The reason we're adding 9 is because we start with a 1% chance, it increases to a 10x multiplier, or not a 1% chance, but we start with a 1x, and now we have a 10x, so the difference of that is 9. 15 plus 9 is 24, 140 plus 9 is 149. That's how we get these new numbers over here, and that works out to about 16%. So we went from about 11% to about 16% of the champions in the game being useful, or the champions in the pool being useful, because we've added 10 more or 9 more champions to that pool. from the useful category. So that has a pretty dramatic impact. If we look now, we only need to pull 800 shards versus our about 1200 shards before to get a useful champion. So that 10x has a pretty powerful impact in this scenario. Again, this is a scenario for a more endgame player with a fairly low number of champions that they might actually consider useful. Of course, no one would ever recommend you pull on a no 2x, no 10x. Like, that's the worst time to pull shards. So, of course, this is pretty bad. If we compare then with no 10x, but we do have a 2x, what's the number of shards that we need to pull? Well, now we're looking at something a lot more reasonable. In this scenario where there's 15 useful champions out of 140, if there's no 10x, we now have our original like 87.5 shards on average to get a legendary champion from the 2x, and we still have a 10.7% chance that one of them is useful. That lowers our number of shards we need to pull to about 816 versus the 10x alone is about 800. So in this scenario, we're still in a world where the 10x is actually beating the 2x, even with no mercy. That's pretty important. I mean, especially again for early game players where there's lots and lots of useful champions. Yeah, you're kind of just going to want to go on the 10x. But over here, that makes a big difference. Of course, if we look at like a buy one get one event, instead of looking at 87.4, we'd be looking at something like 600 to get a legendary champion. I mean, we'd be cutting the numbers in half. And so, you know, then the BOGO event would actually be the best one. Buy one, get one is like, I haven't talked about it as much, maybe as emphasized as much because it's not in the sheets here, but it's a huge, that's probably the best event to pull on, even in these scenarios where, you know, you don't actually need that many champions. That being said, this also gets more extreme with your mercy. So if we look at what happens if we say start at 100 mercy versus starting at no mercy, remember this dramatically lowers the number of shards we need to pull to get a legendary champion, thanks to the fact that the mercy starts to kick in and boost our rates as we get towards the end. We see that now we have a pretty significant difference. With no 10x and a 2x, in the same scenarios, we need to pull 613 shards, whereas with the 10x, we only need to pull 513 shards. So that's pretty impactful. And it, you know, it's a pretty clear scenario where the 10x is actually the superior event to the 2x. Again, I still think the buy one get one is probably better in this scenario, but because you can always just cut this number in half, basically, whenever you have a buy one get one, cut this number in half if there's no 2x on. So, you know, but I think like this math works out, or what it shows is that like this 2x versus 10x, oftentimes the 10x is actually the superior option for getting champions that are actually useful. Of course, the bigger the number of useful champions there are, the larger this percentage is going to be, and therefore the 2x is going to become more powerful. But nevertheless, you can see that for endgame players, it does actually make a lot of sense to favor 10x events over 2x events. So that's pretty much all I have to talk to you about today. The main takeaways we'll highlight in a second. But yeah, I just wanted to give you this as a good breakdown of where we're at. All right, so I hope you found that pretty useful. I would say the main takeaways from this data are that 2x events are not nearly as impactful as people think. It's really only like maybe a 30 to 40% boost to the total number of legendary champions you're going to get if you just pull a bunch of shards. Buy one get one events are really strong because they actually are a full-on doubling of the number of legendary champions that you're going to get, much better than 2x, assuming you can hit the mercy. And that's another one of the major takeaways I want you to get from this video. It's really useful to stockpile large amounts of shards so that you can guarantee you're going to hit your mercy when you do end up pulling those shards. Really impactful. So I realize for new players that's not as useful because you kind of want to be pulling shards to actually fill out your roster, but for endgame players in particular, you definitely want to be sitting on a big stockpile and wait for those perfect events to pull your shards and then go ham. All in all, I think Another takeaway is that the 10x events are not as bad as people think they are. Yes, you still have a pretty low chance of getting a champion that's actually useful, but at the end of the day, given that there's so many champions in the game that aren't really that great once you're an endgame player, especially when we're considering non-voids, 10x start to be a lot more tempting. Um, Other than that, I mean, I think it's just good to know like what to expect when you're pulling shards. 1 in 200 is not a good odds for a legendary champion. You should be looking at more like 1 in 129. But anyway, I hope you've all found this info really useful. If you did, please subscribe to the channel. I am hopefully going to be making some more YouTube content for Raid Shadow Legends in the future. Also, I do stream Raid Shadow Legends probably about 5 days a week at twitch.tv/biohacktv. I rarely stream under the Raid tag itself because I normally stream Black Desert Online. That's my main game, but I have Raid as a little side window where you can see what I'm doing on my different accounts while I play, and I'm always happy to talk about Raid Shadow Legends and hang out with you guys there. So thank you for coming and checking out this new channel. Please subscribe if you haven't done so, and I will see you in the next video.